in studying the development of halakha, we started learning the analysis of Rabbi David Shlush on the history of halakha, and the last question that we posed is what is the process that leads to deciding a halakha following a certain opinion, and whether a rabbi who directed his community to follow one opinion, when he quits or passes away, can the community now change its minhag and follow a different opinion? And the other question that he posed was whether the rabbi of the community can choose from among the different opinions. So he said, before we deal with that, we have to explain how do you decide halakha when you have different opinions? How do you determine which one is the halakha? Because the rule of majority is not always applicable. You have one versus one, or you have several opinions versus one, but they didn't live at the same time, or maybe they were not of the same stature. You could rely on the rule of majority when you deal with a closed system. There's a court, 3 or 5 or 71 judges that all serve on the same court. When you present a question to them, you could say the halakha is like the majority. But when you deal with, let's say you take a question that has to do with burial customs, and you present it to all the rabbis in Israel, all the rabbis in the state of Israel, hundreds, if not thousands of rabbis. Each one of them might have a different opinion. You cannot really reach a simple majority. So he says this: כללי ההלכות שנאמרו בגמרא, פלוני ופלוני הלכה כפלוני, חכמי האמוראים הם שחידשו. He says the first time that you find a rule that says how to decide the halakha is in the Talmud. In the Talmud, in the Gemara, the rabbis would say, if Rabbi X and Rabbi Y disagree, the halakha is always like Rabbi X. If they say, for example, halakha ki rabbi mehaverav, the halakha is like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi when he argues with one person, but when he argues with more than one, the halakha is like them, etc. There are rules like that. So many people think within the the yeshiva world, many people think that those rules are sort of an ancient tradition from before the time of the Gemara. He says no. It was the rabbi of the Talmud living after the Mishnah. Remember we spoke about this timeline. First the Mishnah, then the Talmud. The rabbis of the Talmud decided that these will be the rules. But the rabbis of the Mishnah, who were the first one to present these disputes, they did not make an official rule on how to decide which hacham. And why is that? And that's extremely important. התנאים לא ראו לנכון לקבוע הלכות כמסמרות נטועים במחלוקות שבין החכמים. The rabbis of the Mishnah did not want to make an absolute rule to say every time A and B disagree, you follow A, or every time there is a dispute on this issue or on a certain topic, you will follow that opinion. Why? כי הדינים הנלמדים בקל וחומר והיקש, the laws, the halachot that are based on logical analysis, meaning it's not a tradition that goes all the way back to Sinai. There are certain details that were given to us from Sinai and were transmitted from one generation to another for thousands of years. This we don't touch. But the other laws that are based on logic and analysis and reasoning and changing circumstances, הרשות ביד כל בית דין וביד כל חכם שבכל דור ודור. It is the mandate of every court and of the rabbi or the scholar of every generation ללמוד ולהכריע בהלכה כראות עיני שכלו, to analyze, discuss halakha and decide as he sees fit. שנאמר אל השופט אשר יהיה בימים ההם. The Torah says clearly, you have to go to the judge who lives in your days, or the contemporary judge. And the rabbis raise the question, What do you mean to go to the contemporary judge? Of course, you cannot go to someone who died already, or to someone who will be in the future. Obviously, he has to be bayamim ahem. And the answer that the rabbis give is this: only the shofet bayamim ahem, only the contemporary judge can fully understand your reality, your situation. And that's why they say Yiftah bedoro, Kishmael bedoro. Yiftah was a judge, and he was considered of all the judges the one of the lowest status from a point of view of moral behavior. He's the one who made a vow to sacrifice his daughter. It's a long story, but the rabbi says in his generation he was the authority. You had to follow him, just like in the generation of Shemuel. Shemuel Navi was the first prophet and also anointed 2 kings. He was the highest authority. By the way, this rule was twisted in later generation by saying that since rabbis of previous time wrote halachot and they were codified in books, that they are considered contemporary judges. Like saying, at the time of the Torah, you only had available the opinion of your local judge. But today that we have books, that was already 1,000 years ago, not more. Today that we have books, we have the opinions available. Or in other words, they said we could rely on precedent. When the Torah really did not say that you have to rely on precedent. This is something that really clogs the system. Any judicial system can become clogged because of precedents. And the more precedents you have, a lawyer or a court can delay the process sometimes for decades by citing all the cases that have some bearing on the issue. If you don't use precedent, of course you have to use, when you look at the Torah, the basic arguments of the Torah, but you don't have to cite thousands of cases. You deal just with the case in front of you. This is, by the way, the greatness of Rabbi Yosef Meshash and Rabbi Israel Meir Hazan and other great poskim, mostly among the Sfaradim, was that sometimes they did not go through all the cases that are relevant, but just to the original basic concepts of the Torah and the Mishnah, and continue from there, because they know that otherwise you'll become entangled in the web that you can never get out of. But that was the way to circumvent the idea of go to the contemporary judge. They said, yeah, of course we go to the contemporary judge, but we also look at other contemporary judges who died, and we have their books. So of course not the intention of the Torah. It says it's obvious that the rabbis would not make such a rule, which is dangerous, to say whenever A and B argue, it's always halacha like A, because that invalidates B. Why does he exist? Why even mention him? It doesn't. It's not. It says, so what you'll say, one of them is sharper than the other. It says sometimes the sharper mind could be right on this issue and wrong on another issue. Take Albert Einstein, for example, right? One of the brightest minds of the 20th century. He made a lot of errors in his, and he admitted them. And other scholars, other scientists exposed them or came with theories that proved that his theories are wrong. But he made a lot of important contributions, and a lot of the things he says are true, and we cannot even start to fathom what he said. But that doesn't mean that one was always right. It says it's even possible that if one of the rabbis of the Mishnah would make the rules that the later rabbis made, that meaning that the halakha is always like A, always like B, his colleagues would say, who gave you the authority to make such a rule? Not only that, he says, brings the famous story in the Talmud, but kol shamra halacha kebet Hillel. The rabbis were debating whose halakha should they follow, that of the school of Hillel, that of the school of Shammai. A heavenly voice came out and said, Malachem etzel bet Hillel, shalachat motam bechol makom. Why do you even ask the question? The halakha is always like Bet Hillel. It's a heavenly voice. God is speaking. Rabbi Yeshua got up. He says, sorry, that's not your business. Sorry, in other words, none of your business. En mashgichin bevat kol. Lo b'shamayim. The Torah is not in heaven. You gave it to us, we deal with it. So if a prophet comes and says, this is what God wants now, fine. But forgot to intervene in the halachic dispute, that's not your call. That's a very strong statement. Basically, the rabbi said, we humans, we live the reality, we know what it is, we decide. Later on, this argument of lo b'shamayim was picked on by Christians, and it caused a lot of problems. In the 11th century, there were several Jews who converted to Christianity and wrote books against Judaism. One of them is a priest by the name of Raimondo Martini, wrote a book called Pugio Fidei, the dagger of faith. And he quoted all the texts from the Gemara that could be used against the Jews. And in one of them, he used this statement of Lo Bashamayim. He said the Jews don't even listen to their God. Mm-hmm. So that became the basis to all the disputations, public disputes between rabbis, Jewish scholars, and Christians. Eventually, with hundreds of years later, led to the expulsion from Spain. So, first thing that he establishes is that the rules of ruling, who do you decide like, were not decided by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi when he wrote the Mishnaiot, but rather by the rabbis of the Gemara much later. And the way he suggested it was more a convenience, just to get out of the entanglement of all the halachot, to find a clear path that usually we follow that. And he says this, לאחר שרבנו הקדוש קיבץ כל השמועות והדינים והבורים ששמעו ממשה, once Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi gathered all the previous opinions and put them in the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah was presented to the next generation, and they started creating what we call the Gemara, the Talmud, which is the commentary on the Mishnah. ראה לנכון רבי יוחנן לקבוע כללים בפסיקת ההלכות. Rabbi Yochanan was one of the first rabbis of the Gemara, and he decided to make those rules, as we mentioned before. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. He says, when Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree, halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef, halacha ki Rabbi Yosef, etc. And he made all these rules. But אמרו שם, רב לד לכל הנקל עלי. There was another rabbi at the same time of Rabbi Yochanan who did not follow these rules. He was not fond of these rules. But so this was the first stage. Then once that was done, it became a system that in every couple of generations, people would look back and say when A and B disagree, halacha is like A or B. But we could say that this is more than making it a pre-existing rule, meaning that every time before Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir even open their mouth, halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. It's a retrospective rule, meaning if you look back and you see in all the disputes, usually the halacha tended to be like Rabbi Yehuda, then this sort of a rule of thumb. But it doesn't mean that it would apply absolutely in every case. And so then, after 200 or 300 years of activity in writing the Gemara and the Talmud, they made the same rules for the rabbis of the Talmud. One very famous rule is this: we have a rule that whenever those two rabbis, Rav and Shmuel, have a dispute, then we look at the theme. What do they disagree on? If the dispute is on monetary laws, financial laws, the halacha would be determined like Shemuel. But if it's on issues of what we call isurei, kashrut, or purity, impurity, all the other laws, more ritual or laws of kashrut, the halacha would be like Rav. Now, Rabbi David Shlush says that this rule was not determined when Rav and Shemuel were alive, because otherwise, at a certain point, you have to stop arguing. You just have, you have a question on monetary laws, go ask Shemuel. Question on kashrut, go ask Rav. No, that was determined after they passed away, after a generation or two. People looked back and they saw a trend. In all these disputes, we eventually followed him. In all those disputes, we eventually followed him. But there's another deeper reason here, and that is an important element whenever you study halakha or any development in literature or culture or law, is that you want to understand why between Rav and Shmuel, what is the difference between those two rabbis? The difference is that Shmuel was born and raised in Babylonia, in Bavel. Rav was born in Eretz Israel and later on migrated to Babylonia. So one was local, one was an immigrant. Let's put it this way. Now, generally, at that time, Eretz Israel had the hegemony, that it was on top of the hierarchy, and Bavel was subjugated to it. So, in all the laws that have to do with Isurim, other than monetary laws, kashrut, impurity, whatever it is, you would follow Rav, who represents the tradition of Israel. But when it comes to monetary laws and financial laws, there's something that we call Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land. When you do contracts, when you do transactions, it's not always, you cannot follow a black and white halakha, but rather you have to know the practices, especially when it's not a written contract, but rather oral agreements, right? You need to know what are the practices of the particular town or place that you are in. Because in one place, there's a consensus among sellers, for example, that you could return merchandise within 30 days. And in other places, you could return within 90 days. Today, we can't think like that because everything is written. Everything, the policy is written. You have to place it in a visible place. For example, right, returning merchandise. But back in the day, it was a question of the consensus of the merchants of that city. So Shmuel, who was born in Bavel, was better versed in the financial agreements of the localities. So when you make a rule like that, it's important to know what is the field of knowledge of each rabbi. It's also important. So again, there's the claim of Rabbi Shlush, there's no such thing as absolute knowledge. And everything could be questioned. The absolute things, when we come to halakha, are really the rules of the Torah, that you don't mix meat and milk. Then when it breaks down to the next generation, that is where we see diversity. But okay, we'll continue. Tomorrow.